Okay, I'll admit it. In general, I'm an optimist. But I will tell you, I keep a grain of salt handy because not everything that I read about and hear about is equally worthy of being optimistic about. Some things I think you do need to be a little bit skeptical. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam and I've been living with MS since I was 25 years old, and that was almost 40 years ago. And in all of the things that I've been researching lately, you could be forgiven for thinking that I've been just, excited about every single thing that's been going on. But I'll tell you, I look at a lot of things that I decide not to report on because I'm just not convinced they're going to stand the test of time. The clinical trials are sort of iffy if there even are any. The research sounds a little more hopeful than rigorous, perhaps. So I don't even report it. But once in a while, something will come across that I think, okay, I'm not really sure that based on this study, we're going to see great advances, but if I don't say something about it, you'll run across it, I think. It's the kind of article, it's the kind of news that just kind of gets around. So I just thought I better put it out there and see what we can find out about this new development that, if it was really true, would be great. But as I said, I think we need to be a little bit skeptical about whether things are quite that straightforward. I want to look at the article really quickly with you. This article just appeared April 1st of 2024 in the journal Therapeutic Advances in Neurological Disorders. The title is Exploring the Association Between Weight Loss-Inducing Medications and Multiple Sclerosis, Insights from the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System database. And from that title, it's not clear whether we're going to find that they're saying that weight loss drugs increase the chance of multiple sclerosis or increase the severity of symptoms or the reverse. So interestingly, I'm going to have to read it a little bit to see what it's all about. So according to the abstract, several studies have demonstrated that early childhood and adolescent obesity are risk factors for multiple sclerosis susceptibility. Obesity is thought to share inflammatory components with MS through overproduction of pro-inflammatory adipokines, or e.g. leptin, and reduction of anti-inflammatory adipokines, e.g. adiponectin. Recently, drug repurposing, i.e. identifying new indications for existing drugs, has garnered significant attention, which is very true. As you know, a number of the MS drugs that we use today were actually developed originally for something else entirely. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration Adverse Event Reporting System, or FAERS database, serves not only as a resource for mining adverse drug reactions and safety signals, but also for identifying inverse associations and potential medication repurposing opportunities. Well, you may remember the FAERS database, but it became much more widely known during the COVID pandemic because we all were invited to add our own experience of adverse reactions to it. So what does that tell you right off the bat? The data is collected based on people voluntarily reporting on things that have happened to them. And of course, there's two things that come to mind. Number one, not everybody that has an adverse reaction is going to report that. And number two, the people who do report it may not describe it accurately. So right off, I've got a concern because this tells me this research was not done as a clinical trial or some kind of interventional study, but it was an observational study, and so the conclusions are only as good as the data that you're observing, and you have had no involvement with the collecting of that data in the first place. So you have to trust your data source. And everything that I've heard about FAERS, I'm not so sure that that's a data source I would rely on. But be that as it may, their objective is that they aim to explore the association between weight loss-inducing drugs and MS using real-world reports from the FAERS database. And they designed it by doing a secondary analysis of existing data from the FAERS database, as we talked about. In their methods, we conducted a disproportionality analysis using the FAERS database between the fourth quarter of 2003 and the second quarter of 2023 to explore associations between MS and weight loss-inducing drugs. And I'll say right there, at least they picked a 20-year period. And that is very good because with MS, it takes a long time to develop symptoms and see how they persist or come and go or whatever. And so anything much shorter than that, it's not likely to be very reliable. So that part was good. I'll give them credit for that. They go on to say disproportionality was quantified using the reporting odds ratio. An inverse association was defined when the upper limit of the 95% confidence interval for ROR was less than 1. And I can tell from this paper and many others that I've looked at with you, I probably need to get a little bit better at statistical analysis stuff, at least the terminology and the principles of it, because this kind of stuff, my eyes tend to glaze when I get there. So don't expect that I'm going to be digging into that part of it with any great eagerness or thoroughness. But here are the results. We found an inverse association between MS and anti-diabetic weight loss-inducing drugs. An inverse association means that if you take the drug, you have a lower incidence of MS. If you don't take the drug, you have a higher one. So here are the drugs that they thought were effective. Semaglutide, and I apologize, I'm probably going to mispronounce some of these names. Dulaglutide, liraglutide, empagliflozin, and metformin. Now, metformin we've at least heard of, and by the way, I have heard of other studies using metformin. So that's not too surprising it would show up here. No inverse associations, they say, were found for other weight loss-inducing drugs such as phentermine, bupropion, topiramate, zonsamide, and amphetamine. An exception was naltrexone. Okay, and I'm not really sure why they listed it there and what they actually mean by that. So naltrexone's another one that we've heard of in association with multiple sclerosis. So I'm not surprised once again that it showed up on the list, but I can't tell really what they mean, an exception. Does that mean it really belongs with the first set? I don't know. Not very clear. And the conclusion is that our findings suggest a potential consideration for repurposing anti-diabetic weight loss-inducing drugs, including semaglutide, dulaglutide, and liraglutide, which are glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists, empagliflozin, sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitor, and metformin, which is a biguanide, for MS. This warrants validation through rigorous methodologies and prospective studies. Okay, so you know what they're saying really basically is what we found, it isn't rigorous. You can't really take it to the bank, but it's promising enough that more research really should be done here. So, okay, I'll give them that. More research should be done. Unfortunately, I think that the way it's going to be reported in the news media is not going to carry that nuance at all. And so just letting you know, the scientists realize there's limitations in this study. I started to dig around a little further, and wouldn't you know, I found a really good video from Dr. Brandon Bieber, and I really do appreciate his take on things. Because like me, he wants to be hopeful, but he's also skeptical when he needs to be. And so I'm going to just play a few segments from his video. Oh, it's kind of like a bucket of cold water maybe, but it's also, I think, very important for us to remember Not everything is as rosy as the news articles might make it sound.
Now, this is a bird's eye view, very difficult to interpret, but let's take a look at the raw data. For instance, liraglutide, you can see there were only 12 instances of multiple sclerosis out of nearly 30,000 total cases, and that's around 1 in 2,500. The actual prevalence of MS in the United States is around 1 in 350 to 1 in 500, so this does seem very low, and compare that to some of these other weight loss drugs like phentermine, 10 cases out of 4,700, 1 in 470 risk. That looks more like the background rate of multiple sclerosis, so it definitely looks like something is going on here. It's much easier to interpret the data like this. These are the odds ratio. This vertical line is an odds ratio of 1, meaning the risk in people getting the drug is the same as expected in the general population. You can see for a lot of these other weight loss drugs, they're kind of centered around 1. Maybe there's a little bit of a lower risk in people taking naltrexone, slightly higher risk in people taking Wellbutrin, Topamax, and amphetamines, but kind of overall centered around an odds ratio of 1. But look at these classes of weight loss drugs. So these are the GLP-1 agonists. This is the SGL2 inhibitor that they studied, Jardiance, and this is metformin, an old type 2 diabetes drug. So semaglutide, brand names Ozempic, Wegovy, the odds ratio was 0.238. In other words, a 76% lower risk of multiple sclerosis than expected. For Trulicity, odds ratio of 0.165, roughly 85% lower risk. For liraglutide, Victoza, Saxenda, an 84% lower risk. And for Jardiance, this is the SGL2 inhibitor they looked at, an odds ratio of 0.234, a 77% lower risk. And even metformin, not quite as strong of an effect, odds ratio of 0.39 or 61% reduced risk. And what's most striking is the difference between the different classes of weight loss drugs. Now, as you probably can tell, I am highly skeptical of the results of this study for various reasons. One reason is it's just too good to be true. Let's say that taking a single dose of Ozempic is 100% effective of you ever developing multiple sclerosis for the rest of your life. As implausible as that may sound, it still wouldn't really explain the data. And the reason is the mean age of onset of multiple sclerosis is 30. And a lot of people aren't really taking these drugs at age 18. The risk of type 2 diabetes and obesity increases with age. Now, they don't say in the article what the average age of treatment is, but I suspect that it's fairly close to 30. So if you take the drug at age 30, even if it's 100% effective, it can only reduce your lifetime risk of multiple sclerosis by 50%. And there's a lot of evidence that the onset of MS, the pathophysiologic onset of MS, is long, often years or even decades prior to the first symptom. There's a lot of evidence for this. I won't get into it. So I think it's not really plausible these drugs could cause an 85% causal risk of multiple sclerosis. Another thing is you can't really infer the rate of multiple sclerosis in people taking these drugs from these data because it's not a real population study. It's just voluntary reporting. I think maybe what's going on here is there's some bias in what types of side effects people tend to report. Like Ozempic is well known to cause gastrointestinal side effects, pancreatitis, malnutrition in some cases, things like that. And people are going to report those side effects. Whereas even if people get multiple sclerosis, they may not associate it with Ozempic and they may be less likely to report it. Whereas if someone took a vaccine and shortly after got symptoms of MS, they may be much more likely to associate the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis with that vaccine and be more likely to report it. There's definitely a cognitive bias here. Another thing is, even if these drugs do prevent you getting multiple sclerosis, does that mean they treat multiple sclerosis? Not necessarily. I mean, these are two different things. There's a lot of evidence that Epstein-Barr virus is part of the causal pathway of MS, but a recent drug trial, ATA-188, did not show any benefit in the treatment of multiple sclerosis. This is an anti-Epstein-Barr virus immunotherapy. I don't know if it's that specific drug, but it may be that once Epstein-Barr virus turns on your immune system, it's too late. You need a different sort of treatment. The same may be true with the fat cells and the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and may be involved in the initiation of multiple sclerosis, but not necessarily the prognosis of the disease. The other thing is there are a lot of questions about the long-term safety of these drugs, and of course this is true for weight loss and type 2 diabetes too. Even if these drugs work, are you going to take them forever? Are you going to take them for 30 years? The risk may be much greater than in these short-term 1 to 2 year clinical trials, and it's really hard to know the long-term risks for certain. And now I do think there could be something here. This is interesting preliminary data. It's certainly interesting that there's a big difference between different classes of weight loss drugs, and it warrants further research. And there is some ongoing research. This is a randomized trial for metformin versus placebo in progressive MS in Belgium, 120 participants. We'll see what the results show. I'd be interested to see a randomized trial for Ozempic or a similar drug, but it doesn't exist yet. There is some small observational data suggesting these drugs are safe in people with multiple sclerosis. They don't exacerbate the disease, at least in small observational studies, though there's no evidence they're beneficial in either observational or randomized trials.
Well, I thank Dr. Bieber for his appraisal of this study. And I especially appreciated how he unpacked all those statistics and made sense of the stuff that I was just skipping over. Does it mean that there's absolutely no good that's going to come from it? No. But I think the important thing for us to remember is that we just aren't there yet. If you're going to do a study like this, and you're going to have people changing their treatment options based on it, I really think it needs to be more of an actual interventional study, maybe a clinical trial, not just an observational study where you look at data, especially data that's been self-reported, so you know you're not even getting the totality of the different pieces of data that you might have needed to analyze. You can't draw conclusions from a data set that has so many flaws. Other than that, it could be really exciting, right? It could be great, and maybe someday we'll find out that it is indeed living up to the claims. And I'd be happy with that. But in the meantime, we take really good care of ourselves. So I'll see you again in my next video.